Good evening and welcome to Pull. The August presidential and provincial council elections in Afghanistan saw a historic increase in the number of women participating in the political process. Over 300 ran for office, many despite personal danger and enormous risk. While women reportedly voted in significant numbers in the north and central regions, the turnout was notably low in the south and southeast. But as U.S. Senator John Kerry told the Council on Foreign Relations, the role of women is important to the success of Afghanistan.
Effective governance in Afghanistan must also respect women's voices. Afghan women's groups have fought hard to have a seat at the table, and we should support these indigenous efforts because one of the easiest ways to empower Afghans is to empower Afghan women.
Joining me to discuss the success of women in Afghan politics and the challenges that remain are three people who have helped train and empower women in Afghanistan. Palwasha Hassan serves as the country director for rights and democracy in Afghanistan at the U.S. Institute for Peace. She spent more than 15 years working with women's development and empowerment projects in Afghanistan and helped negotiate the constitutional Loya Jirga and the peace Jirga on Afghanistan and Pakistan. Anita McBride served as an assistant to President George W. Bush and Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush from 2005 to 2009. She's also a member of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, a public-private partnership between the U.S. and Afghan governments to help Afghan women rebuild their country. And Kristin Haffert is the director of women's political participation programs at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. She helped manage the successful campaigns for several female candidates in the state of California. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
Anita, studies have shown that educated and politically active women have a positive impact on societies. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely, I agree with that. Women at first are the key to peace in this region, in Afghanistan, in the Middle East. I believe that wholeheartedly. I think education, without education, it's difficult for women to progress in any other sector of civil society. So I do believe that education is the key.
And as Chief of Staff to First Lady Laura Bush, you traveled to Afghanistan several times.
Correct.
What changes and progress did you see during that time?
With the women, there were more opportunities, more women going to school, more women training to be teachers. That was really important to Mrs. Bush. She had helped create the Women's Teacher Training Institute at Kabul University. She went to see the first class of graduates in 2005 on our first trip there. She spoke to women who were living in these dormitories on the grounds of Kabul University where their families felt that it was safe for them to come and train to be teachers and that they would go back to their provinces and teach and also train other teachers. So each time we went, we heard of progress in this area of education, that more girls were going to school. By the third trip that we went in 2008, she was very happy to be in Bamiyan province. She had promised Governor Sarabi that she would come there before she left, and we were able to see the midway construction of a new children's center in Bamiyan for children that had no other place to go to school.
And Kristin, you participated in a special program for the National Democratic Institute. You've trained American women who've run for political office successfully, and you've trained Afghan women who have run for office. What are some of the similarities that you saw, and what elements were different?
Well, I think the interesting thing that you find is that women all over the world face the same challenges, and I think this is the case for women in Afghanistan as well. Some of the things that we heard, NDI actually interviewed about 18 women from 9 provinces who were candidates, so we tracked them throughout the race, and many of these were women that we trained. And we heard from them that fundraising was a huge challenge, and this is something that you hear from women all over the world. They don't have access to their own funds, and so it's sort of the borrowing and the being creative about trying to develop your own resources to be able to find a little bit of money to create posters and to do the basics of campaigning.
And if you were giving advice to women who may be interested in getting involved in politics, what advice would you give them in terms of structuring their campaign and how they would go about raising campaign funds?
I think where you start with women in some cases is just actually helping them have the confidence to know that they can run. A lot of women, again, everywhere in the world, and we saw this in Afghanistan, they think they need to be more prepared than men. They think they need to do much more homework, and really they're just as capable. They're running the homes, and they really have a significant role in society, whether it's behind the scenes or not. And so it's really first having that confidence. But then one of the things we trained women in, which we saw them do, and they told us about it as we interviewed them through the process, was that they went door to door. And of course, in the South and the East, that wasn't as easy, and some of the campaigning that women did was in the homes and happened very privately. But other women really organized to go door to door and talk to people and tell them what their message was. And this is something that I think, no matter where you are, whether it's Afghanistan or elsewhere, you have to be able to get your message out.
And you mentioned, having funds. Do you know of any donor programs that would help provide funds to Afghan women at this time who want to run for office?
Well, there are a lot of groups that tend to do more of the in-kind training. So it's rather than finding direct funds, I know that UNIFEM, for example, during the campaign, they enabled women to photocopy campaign posters. Now, they were in black and white, they weren't in color like a lot of the men's posters, but women traveled from all over Afghanistan to a resource center to be able to photocopy posters.
Palwasha John, in 2004 there was one female candidate for President, Masouda Jalal. In this past election there were 2 women who ran. Do you think that Afghan women are more vocal now?
I think so. They're vocal, and also they're more organized. And I think the conscious of participation and political participation is getting more and more, and women are getting more interested. So one of the positive thing about 2 women being candidate for the presidency is, for most women, they knew like they probably will not win. But I think their candidacy was important from aspect that women want to secure the places where they probably at one time be able to win as a president. I know it'll take a long time, but the important thing is, like, maybe in contrary to some other countries, for instance, neighboring Iran, where a woman cannot be the head of the state. This is a big achievement for Afghan women in Afghanistan, that they can still run. And I think in each election we will have women to keep that momentum going on.
More on training and development for female candidates when we come back. Continuing our conversation with Anita McBride, Kristin Haffert, and Palwasha Hassan. I want to talk again about the recent election. Kristin, you were there for 5 weeks on the ground as an observer. Did you see an increase in women's political participation?
Absolutely. We were very pleased to know that the number of women who ran for office this time increased. It was 285 women that ran for provincial councils in 2005, and this time it was 328. And so that was a very promising number. And we, as I said earlier, we heard that women were campaigning, and they were campaigning actively. And they were even campaigning in 2 provinces where the races actually weren't competitive. So you didn't have enough women running, and they were sort of guaranteed seats in Kandahar and Uruzgan, but they were out there campaigning anyway, sometimes at great risks, great personal risks.
You mentioned 328 seats. However, in the beginning, there was about 64 women who nominated themselves to run for provincial seats. Do you think that a lot of women there are just waiting for the community to kind of bring them into the process? And do you see that as a similar trend for men?
I think it's true that women do wait on some level, and also go out and seek approval from their tribal and elder leaders in their communities. I think with women, though, it also starts with the family. Yes. And you see that women in Afghanistan are really not going to run unless they have support from their families.
And Anita, you were also there as an election observer.
Not quite as long as Kristin, but yes.
For a short period to observe the elections. Do you think that there were enough female poll workers that were staffed in order to allow more women to vote?
Well, I think what I saw of the female poll workers at all of the stations that I went to was just how proud they were to be able to have this opportunity to participate in their election, and to help women, encourage women to come vote. Of course, we were disappointed in the numbers because the numbers are so dramatically fewer than they were in 2004 and 2005.
Why do you think, I know there's security disillusionment with the process,
Sure.
social pressures,
Sure.
Being there on the ground,
Right.
what was your assessment of why there was less women
Well,
voting?
of course, the local conditions really are a big factor, and security is at the top of the list. And I think the other, point that Kristin made is obviously family support, community support to be involved. But security is obviously the #1 factor that impacted the elections. But back to the poll workers and the women that I saw, they were the only ones at all the polling stations I went to that actually checked my ID card as an observer, documented that I was there. I mean, really took this very seriously. And I think to the point that was, made here, it is going to take time. I mean, in a short period of time, look at all the progress, really, that women have made. The numbers of those that are interested in participating in the political process or interested in becoming legislators is growing. And going back to the point, the more that they are educated, the more that they are empowered, the more that they will have a chance to
Kristin,
contribute.
what do you think?
I would just add one of the other bright spots that we saw is the number of domestic election observers through FIFA, the local NGO that organized election observers. That number of women went up, so that was also exciting. The number of poll watchers went up, and those were party poll watchers, presidential, provincial council. Those numbers went up as well. We did hear some anecdotal evidence that there were polling stations where women weren't, there weren't enough staff in some of the polling stations. And this was something that we hope the IEC will plan ahead for, to a greater degree for the upcoming elections, to make sure that there are not only enough staff, but there are also enough security guards and female body searchers.
Palwasha John, with this election that did have issues of fraud, there was an issue that some women were not going to the polls and their husbands were acting as a surrogate for them and using their registration card to vote for them. How do you think this played in with the issue of the legitimacy of the process?
That's true, and we cannot deny the fact that in some places it happened like that. But in spite of that, I will say I know of women who really independently acted, and I don't even talk about educated women. I met women in a very local places like hammam and school and on the street who were talking to me and they were taking this very serious, the election and the participation. Even in some provinces, not only in south but in north, for instance in Takhar, Faryab, the number of women registered as a candidate was very low, and some provinces even there was no candidate. And women groups acted very actively on this and went to the provinces, encouraged women to go and not to lose this.
One of the things, in fact, that reminded me, of course, like NDI, who has spent so much time investing in Afghan women, and IRI, which was the group that sponsored me to go, that has been there with every election, 2004, 2005, this past election, and they'll be with the women of Afghanistan and all of the people of Afghanistan in the next election as well. But there are so many wonderful grassroots groups. In fact, the Movement for Afghan Sisters, a brand new grassroots group that developed in 2008, mobilized 25,000 women around Afghanistan to participate in the process. Also helped to lead and support and train 46 candidates for Prudential Council, of which 28, I believe, won. So those are numbers. Again, we want to see those increase, but you've got to start somewhere after so much time.
Yeah, Kristin, if I can ask you, the issue of women running for office and voting, but what about the male candidates?
Sure.
You were there for 5 weeks. Did you see them including women's issues in their platforms?
Actually, I'm glad you asked this because it sort of ties into what we were just talking about. I was very struck by the role of the local women's NGOs in Afghanistan. And I think actually it had a tremendous impact on sort of the buzz around women's issues at the presidential candidate level. And I think you saw the presidential candidates talking about women's issues in a way that hadn't been done before. And sure, Masouda Jalal in 2004 did talk about women's issues, but I think it was a bit different. And of course you had the male candidates to it. And that was because I know Palwasha was involved in some TV programs with UNIFEM where they actually asked some of the candidates questions, but in the media you saw a different level of women's issues addressed, and I think that's very exciting because it's in the public dialogue.
More on lessons learned from the last Afghan election after this. Back with Anita McBride, Kristin Haffert, and Palwasha Hassan. Let's go back to the importance of education and information to increase women's political participation. Anita, as a member of the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, you followed the developments again of Afghan women over the years. What role did you see media playing in the process?
Media, in fact, this past election, particularly, the role of the independent media was very critical. It was one of the bright spots. In addition to the presidential debates, which really helped to elevate the discussion of issues and substance in the campaign, the role of the independent media cannot be eliminated in this discussion. And in fact, because of that, the U.S. Afghan Women's Council, which has over its 8-year period focused on education and health and political participation and economic empowerment, now wants to add another pillar on the training in independent journalism, for women, because we saw how critical the role was.
So, the access to information and getting it out to the public. Kristin, what about training of actually women? Were there organizations that you said provided the training? How effective were those training programs?
We received very positive feedback from, I know the women that NDI trained, for example, we trained 80 of the 117 women that have provisionally been elected. So that was a very promising number. And in some cases, this was the only training that some of these women had ever had. One of the things that we did hear from women, however, was that they had hoped that increased outreach even more in advance of the elections on the awareness of voting and what that means and the privacy of vote, and sort of more access to the registration process would be even more helpful in addition to the training. But I think, we focused on campaign messages, going door to door, and many of the things that we heard were ultimately done. So we heard very promising things from the women candidates.
So, there were resources provided by civil society, but Palwasha, John, because of the cultural restrictions, some families would not allow women to either use their image on their posters or to campaign publicly. In other families, they didn't object. Do you think that the women who were restricted in that way, do you think that they were able to even get their message out to the people?
I think yes, because over the years of war, women have been able to learn ways which is helping them to navigate around the cultural barriers, and they know how to talk to other women, in this case, to have their vote on the day of the election. So yes, it's not easy in Afghanistan, and we really cannot compare Afghanistan situation to other countries. So I think they took the risk. The women who were brave enough to stood there against all sorts of security risk, I think that's important from a women's right point of view.
Going back to the Sharia question, though, for the voters, there are some women who want to wear the burqa, but that presents issues of identifying them when they actually go to vote. And how do you think other Muslim countries have dealt with this issue of identifying the women, but then, respecting their modesty?
I think that is creating a little bit problem, especially in an Afghanistan case, because there was reports of misuse of the cards which didn't have the photo, not photo with the burqa, but without any photo. So on one hand, it's important to adopt some affirmative action to support increased women participation in such processes, but this can also create misuse of women cards as well.
But in terms of Sharia, what do you think Sharia says with respect to women voting?
from even Prophet time, women were throughout the Islamic history part of the politics, and maybe not in the today's modern way of going and taking picture and getting cars and stuff like that. But if you go back, like in Afghanistan, we had women in parliament more than 60, 70 years back, and we had women part of the political scenario. This was not like an absence, and there is a history to that.
Kristin, as a foreigner who was there, helping with the elections in terms of being an observer, did you see these religious or cultural restrictions affecting some of the women who are running for office?
Well, I think Palwasha picked up on an important point, and one of those was yes, the fact that photos weren't required on the voter ID cards was a challenge. And I think if you look at places like Yemen, for example, where NDI has done a lot of work, they have found ways to ensure that we can check women's identification as long as we are honoring that women are in women-only polling stations and that women are doing the checking. And I think that's possible in a place like Afghanistan. And maybe you don't use photos, maybe you look at eye scan technology and new other ways of requiring that identification. But I think this is one way that cultural issues did influence the process. But I do think there's a way around it, and looking forward to see how we can better protect women's vote and make sure that they're able to vote.
Great. And Anita, and you've worked, for several administrations.
Sure.
You've worked as the chief of staff to a first lady. Once in office, what can a woman do to actually effectuate change?
It's very important to remember where they need as much help to know how to legislate and how to be good legislators, to give them the tools and the support to really be effective, understand the laws, how to interpret them, and then also how to explain them to your constituents so that they can see what impact they're having on their lives. Come together, find common ground, find a mission that you can stand behind, and use this as an example for other women in your country. And they worked through the night and came up with a mission statement to develop a women's caucus for women that work in the ministries. I mean, that was a very encouraging sign.
And Palwasha John, with all of these challenges, Afghan women are part of the broader society. What message would you share with your Afghan brothers back home regarding the importance of women's political participation?
The important message is men alone cannot build and reconstruct Afghanistan. It's very much important in political reconstruction, in physical and whatever in Afghanistan development that we are expecting. It cannot be achieved by men alone. It's very important for the sake of Afghanistan to count on women, to count on their participation, and women are able to deliver, and probably much better in some circumstances, because women really have been through unique experiences. They went through a lot of hardship, and they learn a lot to contribute.
My thanks to Anita McBride, Kristin Haffert, and Palwasha Hassan. We'd love to hear what you think about this or any other poll program. Just go online to aamtv.tv or visit us at tolo.tv. See you next week for another edition of Pull.